Excellent. Welcome everybody to this Joining the Dots webinar. Great to have so many of you with us, and thank you too for your patience starting just a little bit late because we've been trying to sort out a slight technical glitch, as is always the case. Teams throws something up in order to confuse us, and on this occasion it's that one of our presenters and panelists is unfortunately not able to, or at least we are not able to see them, but we'll no matter press ahead with that and look forward to this afternoon's conversation. So hopefully you're here for the role of data in advocacy. And when we were talking about what we might want to build into the current webinar program, this was a suggestion that I advanced partly because it brings together a couple of my passions, both the role of data in informing intervention design or policy measures, or how we do good quality service delivery, with the whole area of advocacy. And as some of you will know, I'm, as well as a role in Agilicis, I also am the chair of the UK's Parliamentary Advisory Council for Transport Safety, and do a lot of work with NGOs both in the UK and internationally to try and improve and build capability around pushing for good quality road safety measures and interventions. So it seemed like a natural fit to sort of bring those together and say, how do we do better at integrating data and evidence into the way in which we do road safety? And are there things that we could also do better in terms of bringing together, with a common vocabulary of that data and evidence, those who maybe sit within the public sector, decision makers, policymakers, those who are responsible for implementing road safety measures, with those who are advocating for change, i.e. those who are working outside of the public sector but in aligned roles in charities, NGOs, supporting groups, and that sort of thing. So I am delighted to say this has come together, and we've got three brilliant contributors for you this afternoon to lead into this discussion. And I'm going to let them sort of introduce themselves a little bit as they sort of respond to a first question I'm going to throw at them. But I'm delighted to be joined by Ian Greenwood, who was for a couple of years a trustee of PACT along with me, and I've really appreciated his work both as an advocate but as somebody who is also brings a research background. Got Rebecca Morris. Rebecca and I have our worlds have overlapped for many years, right back from sort of safety camera program times through to her continued work on supporting the rollout of Vision Zero and some key policy asks as part of that. And Robert Wheatman, who works for Living Streets in Scotland. And I've always appreciated Robert's sort of challenge and sort of differences of perspective, or challenging some of our sort of conventions, particularly where it draws on new and enticing evidence. So great to be joined by them. Ian, I'm going to come to you first. Basically, I just want to sort of give you an opportunity to sort of say a little bit about the work that you're doing, and also sort of say, how do you see the importance of data and evidence in helping us to advocate for change, to push for something better within our sort of broader democratic society?
Firstly, Dan, thank you for the invitation. I think this is a beautiful concept, and I'm really looking forward to the next 50 minutes. So I quite simply advocate to stop road death, which sounds really quite simple. And I go through a process to try and persuade people, not always very easy, that saving lives is actually a really worthwhile task in life. That is equally not that easy. So I find that quite confounded, actually, in lots of different ways. And I try to seek conditions where we can find like-minded people with similar messages to advocate for good things that make people's lives better, or in my case, stop people being killed or seriously injured. ending up in an NHS bed. I spent my main career in the health system, being a clinician and a manager, so I saw the direct result of crashes and collisions that do lots of damage to lots of different people. And one of the ways I try to do that, whilst recognizing that we all do this slightly differently, we all come with different experience, with different views and values and different skill sets, I try to do that by focusing on what the evidence tells us, supported by data and knowledge. Sometimes that's quite difficult because often people do this. They don't want to hear the knowledge and they don't want to hear the evidence. So I hope that comes out in the discussion today. But underpinning that for me is a very personal story. My life story is that my 12-year-old daughter was killed in a car crash a long time ago, so she's forever 12. So having that life experience has motivated me to do what I do, but I'm very careful to do it that way around. So I advocate based on what is right for society, in my view, based on evidence that I can find, but also very clearly underpinned by my life experience. And importantly, Dan, it's not the other way around. I know other people choose to advocate in different ways. Difference is good. I'm not making any judgment. I'm just describing the way that I choose to do that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ian. And I think, that's why when we first thought about bringing this panel together, you were a name that immediately leapt to mind because of that sort of balancing those two things, holding those things in tension. Robert, I wonder whether I could come to you next. Obviously, you're sort of working in a slightly aligned but different area to Ian with your work with Living Streets. And yeah, like what took you into that sort of advocacy piece, and how do you see that sort of our need for data and evidence to inform that work?
Great big question. Yeah, so I'll just introduce myself very briefly. I work for Living Streets part-time and for myself part-time, so some people may also know me from that role. I'm saying that partly because there's a fair chance that much of what I'll offer today will be personal opinion rather than a Living Streets position, which is kind of what you'd expect, I think. What brought me into this individually is a really interesting question, and it's probably something to do with being awkward and liking being the person in the room that wants to say, oh, I've got a different view from you. And I've tried to professionalize that rather than it become something that antagonizes people. And I guess around data, I almost find myself in that position immediately, in that my starting point, and Dan, I wrote back, because back to you, just some initial thoughts from myself. And the first one I wrote down was that data doesn't change people's opinions. And that I always want to say that because I think people think it does. I think people quite often think, and Ian, I think your perspective there is interesting. You take data to people and they don't want to listen. And I think my whole perspective on life and my whole perspective on advocacy and data is that the data is something that people can use to enable them to work their way through the system once they've already made their mind up. It's not the thing that people change their minds around. And I also, I guess my other kind of half of me around kind of ideas around data are that it can be quite dangerous as well. So I should say data is very valuable. It's very valuable when, in the work that we do. It also, at the same time, we need to remember it's dangerous. It's dangerous in that it can distract people. We quite often end up working on things that can be measured and ignoring the things that can't be measured because, people want evidence that you've made a difference, which means that you have to work to the measurable stuff. And I think that really matters around this. And that comes back to, again, some of the stuff that Ian, you said, which is, if we are, my job, I see my job as being to, quite often my job is to open people's eyes, I guess. And that sounds a bit like, that almost sounds arrogant, but I don't mean it like that. I mean, most people spend most of their lives swimming out in the sea of streets and roads that exists and don't have any idea that it could be different because you never see different. It's that we have what we have. And I guess I see my job as saying to people, actually, it doesn't have to be like that. You could still have people driving and cars can still be a thing, whilst the streets can be designed in a very fundamentally different way. that I think of that as opening people's eyes, so that they're like, oh, I just never realized that. And I find that an amazing point when somebody comes back to me and says, Robert, I see that thing that you talked about all over the place now. You've completely revolutionized, you spoiled the city for me. And I think that's interesting. The data comes along afterwards. Now that you are converted and you want to see a different world, now let's work with some data that you can use to argue your case.
That's great. Just as you were talking there, I don't know whether you've ever come across Rory Sutherland's book, Alchemy. So Rory Sutherland, for anyone who sort of followed any of his work, he's a marketeer essentially, and what he really tries to do is to kind of get people to see sort of the other side of the argument. But one of the things that he really labours in that book is just how much of our decision making is not as rational as we would like to think it is. So much of it is post hoc rationalization, where we do kind of grab for the data that justifies the things that we already have decided we want to do. And therefore, you know, sort of again, reflecting what both yourself and Ian have said, sort of helps to make us feel better about the things that we've already got in mind to proceed with. I was going to go to Rebecca, but she's been dropping in and out of the call as we still try and sort out these technical difficulties.
Whilst we're waiting for Rebecca, can I make a quick comment on what Robert's just described?
Yeah, please do.
I think where we start with this is really quite important. So I think what I often observe is people start with their answer and they have their version of the evidence or the data that they then force on. I use that language provocatively, but can't say that word. And what often will happen is you lose people before you even start. So I think one of the kind of messages I want to get across today is think very carefully about where you start with your advocacy and how you use evidence and data within that, rather than start with so many people died last year, because you automatically switch a huge audience off if you start with the data and the evidence. And I think that's a different example, but similar to what Robert was describing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I guess where I sort of wanted to go next was, and actually, yes, sorry, just seeing Keith put something into the chat. What I intended to do at this juncture was to say, please, this conversation is not just to happen between the 3 and hopefully 4 of us, if we can get Rebecca in and the technology working. Please do also add into that conversation now as well. So there is the Q&A feature in Teams. So if you've got a specific question that you would like to ask of our panelists, please do use the Q&A feature. I'm going to use that in order to sort of pick up the specific questions that you want to ask. But similarly, we've also got the chat feature. If you want to engage together and get a bit of a kind of side chat going about some of the things that have been raised, your own personal experiences, that sort of thing, please do contribute to the chat as well. This will be a much more engaging 45 minutes that we've got left of our discussion if you do contribute in those ways. Now, I think we've resolved things with Rebecca. So Rebecca, can you talk to us from the other side?
Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes, we can hear you and we can see you. So I'm going to add you to the spotlight so everyone gets to see you, which is great.
Just been out for a rainy dog walk. I'm not sure if that's such a good thing today. Thank you. I'm not sure what's going on with the technology, but moving on from that, yeah, I thank you so much for inviting me to be part of today. My world, as Dan said, has been in road safety, marketing and PR now for over 20 years, and I very much proudly campaign now with other organisations across the country, with bereaved families who are campaigning for change, and working very closely on the Protect Young Drivers campaign with Ian. And it's really about making sure that we're telling stories about real people and about real lives and how real people are affected every day by road harm, and making sure that that message is getting out there continually, because I don't think people really understand what goes on our roads unless they sadly become a victim themselves, and then it's too late. So I think it's about making sure we use that data that we have effectively to make sure it's real for people to understand.
So that's where I was going to go next. Actually, it was just in this sort of question of, like, if people are kind of clinging to bits of data to justify, you know, the narrative that they have already kind of bought into, is it a kind of a done deal, or how do we actually kind of break through in that? And obviously you, Rebecca, have been working on the kind of, particularly the sort of media communication side of things for many years. Like, how do we get cut through, and in what ways can we get the data to really work for us in terms of helping to reinforce a new narrative rather than, you know, perhaps what people have bought into themselves?
I think what we need to move away from as organisations, particularly sort of local authorities, police forces, is we've always looked to the casualty data to guide us. Do we have a casualty problem with this particular road user group? What does the casualty data say? That's all we've had. And essentially what we're doing there is waiting for people to be killed or injured to know if we have a problem on a particular route. And just the other day, I was at the Vision Zero conference in Greater Manchester. Lots of professionals there. Tanya, your colleague, obviously, we're a long-standing road safety partnership data analyst specialist as well, Dan. And she talks exactly the same way as I do about this. You know, when we used to work in the world of safety cameras, you know, you'd get members of the public who would actually be supportive of enforcement. They wanted a camera. But you'd have to write to them sometimes and say, I'm really sorry, but we can't install a camera there, or we can't operate a mobile camera there because not enough people have been killed or injured. And that's a terrible message and a terrible situation that we're dealing with there. We should never be using that as a reason for not acting. And there's so much technology out there these days, which means we don't have to do that, but we just need to be using it. And we need that national steer to enable, and that national support allow to enable those local authorities to invest in that technology that will allow us to move away. Because that's such a powerful message to be able to share with your community, is we're no longer acting after. You know, we're not waiting for people to die or be injured. We are going to work proactively. We're not going to be reactive anymore. We're going to work as proactively as we can. And that's a hugely powerful message. And you're really doing everything in your power then to protect your communities.
Right. Robert, I wonder to sort of push this back to you, because you said in your answer to the first question, one of the things you delight in is trying to help people to see the world in a different way. You know, what are some of the things that you found that do help to kind of cast a new narrative around our use of streets and public spaces?
I'm glad you asked me that question, because I was about to jump up and say, hey, I've got something to say on this. So yeah, I think, you know, if I talked about kind of opening people's eyes, and I guess I'd like to extend that and say, I think data can be useful and evidence can be useful, particularly when it's telling people something they don't already know. We often, in our campaigning advocacy sort of world, people quite often think that the obvious thing to do is to tell people the obvious stuff. So campaigners around cycling will quite often tell you that cycling is good for the environment and it keeps you healthy, but actually 99% of the people they're telling that to already know it. And I think that there's a problem in that. People, as Rebecca, as you said, people back off. People, you know, start to defend their existing position for why they can't cycle, why cycling's a bad thing, because you're nagging at them about something they already knew. But you can tell people things which they don't know, and the road safety data, the Stats 19 data, I actually find very powerful. I used this for real very recently, where close to where I live, and I won't bother saying where that is because that means I can be a bit more open. Close to where I live, somebody was seriously injured, and there was a bit of a fuss. That's not the right word, but you know, some people were talking about, this is terrible, something ought to be done. And I had some of the people I was talking to were part of that. And I said to them, hold on, let me just show you something. Before you go any further down that line, you need, as professionals in this environment, you need to know this. And what I showed them was the local picture of how many people had been hurt and killed in that local area over the last 20 years, 25 years. From the Stats 19 data, and that for them was a complete opening of their eyes. They thought there's a problem, there must be a problem at this junction. Somebody's just been hurt at this junction. And what I could show them is there is a problem with the system. There are huge numbers of people being killed all over the place. And when you go to talk to the local authority about what's going on here, you need to understand that's what they see. Potentially, they don't see just this one injury. They see actually this whole thing, and they don't think it can be changed. They think it's just about balancing everything, and that's just a fact of life. Whereas we, in our world, we can say, no, that's not okay. That's not all right. It's not all right for that. That picture I can show you on a map of all the people, and that, you know, this road, you can identify where the road is. You can take the map away, and you can see where the roads are from all the people that are hurt. That's not an okay thing. It just really struck me that was where I thought they won't know this. And when I showed them it, they should have known it already because they work in my field. They didn't know. It was a complete opening of their eyes. We didn't know the world was like that. Now we understand why the whole system has to change. So I think that there's it's just to say that I think said data is dangerous and there are risks in it. In the right circumstance, even the Stats 19 kind of data can be a very, very powerful thing.
Yeah, and we all love, don't we, to kind of feel like we've got a bit of inside knowledge to share. I mean, you know, sort of even at my age and stage of life, if I think I'm the first one in my team who's read a report, I love to share it and like be the first one to make sure it's on the chat and others have got access to it. But I mean, Ian, just in the light of what Robert's saying there, I mean, you talked about the frustration of trying to communicate to decision makers and get them to see the world differently. And sometimes it is in the data, but sometimes it's also in the stories, as we've been touching on. What have you found that kind of, I guess helps them to sort of grapple with the data in a new way because they're seeing it from a different lens, maybe because they're hearing your personal story or because they're realizing the real human cost of some of the data that they're presented with?
I'm going to start in a strange place, Dan, so please drag me back if I'm going in the wrong direction. If I'm in the pub and talking to somebody and they say, what do you do for a living? I never ever say I advocate to stop road death. So I think what I would say is it depends on the audience that you are engaging with, who they are, what your assessment of their set of circumstances, not in a patronizing way, but their level of interest, their level of knowledge. And I think one of the things that I often observe is people are on push factor. So rather than stopping and chatting and listening, engaging, I'm talking about politicians specifically now, just to illustrate, what often happens is people will bang the table and demand. And I know from my NHS days, sat around boardroom tables, when you had public meetings, when people bang tables and shout at you, you're not really going to engage that carefully with them. I'm much more interested in listening to the argument, even if that's a critical argument. So in terms of advocating and evidence, I really do think that we need to spend more time thinking about who we're trying to engage. And if we again disappear into public policy for just a second, one of the things about public policy that says if you advocate for a policy change, which through what mechanism, is understanding what's on the other side. So people assume that policy making is rational. They assume that it's orderly, and it's anything but. Years in health and social care has shown me that, because I got involved with policy from that point of view. And I think what I'm suggesting is that if there's more understanding of what's at the other side of the table. So if we look at Lillian, the Secretary of State and the Minister for Roads, for example, one comes from a union background and one comes from a pure political background, having studied EU change, I think, or something. Nothing wrong with that. That's not a criticism, but understanding their perspective of where their experience has taken them, and then you engage in what often are very complex and often complicated subject matters, like speed and speeding is a really, really good example. Everybody has a view about it. There's very few experts out there. So I encourage people to think very carefully about engaging and communicating, finding the right language, finding the button that you can press with that person, and it will really, really different with different people. I've always said something in the chat, which is lots of people hate maths. Yes. So if you're going to engage with somebody that hates maths and numbers and data, and you're going to talk to them about maths, numbers and data, you've switched them off completely. You're not going to engage with them. So I think spending time, and you need to be patient with this. I've learned that over the years I've been doing this. Things don't happen quickly. My research has proven that in terms of the policy cycle and how long agenda setting can take over a very long period of time. But what I try to do is just engage on a human level with people before you start to build a case. I've not been that successful with things like graduated driving licensing, so I'm not suggesting that it actually works. But I do think you do move forward much more rapidly than bang the table, throw a load of data at somebody, and then expect them to respond to it when their background is nowhere near what you are trying to advocate. And one thing very quickly, if we remember that any minister will have, I don't know, dozens or maybe hundreds of portfolios of which they have zero experience. And they have to prioritize. And if you have 150 people all telling you 650 different things, you're going to pick the things that fit with your ideology and your knowledge base and your experience, not necessarily what the evidence or the data is saying to you.
Yeah, brilliant. Just sort of following that thread, Ian's talked, Rebecca, about the kind of sort of policy going in at Secretary of State, you know, Minister of Transport. I guess there's also the sort of the need to sort of push up and sell the message within an organisation, you know, from the grassroots, maybe working from inside transport teams and inside partnerships and that sort of thing. I was just wondering whether, you know, there's anything you want to sort of highlight there about the way in which we win that conversation incrementally within organizations, in order, and maybe, you know, what sort of data helps us to do that, so that we take people with us, because at a certain point, whether it is heads of transport or senior police officers or chief execs of councils, we've got to get people on board all the way up the political ladder, haven't we?
Yeah, and I think that is a challenge, and I know I've seen that with organisations, you know, in terms of Vision Zero. It's getting people to understand that what Vision Zero is, and how we've all got a role to play, and every stakeholder has a role to play, and to genuinely get that support, because otherwise it just becomes words. And I do worry that without central support, our strategies can feel like words, even for those of us amongst us who absolutely get it and who are 100% committed to reducing road harm. I think we need it to be on the government's agenda, so that it can be on our local agendas, because I think it's very difficult to do it the other way around. And I think, yeah, Robert said a couple of things just then that I think were really interesting and really simple, like, it's not okay, and we all need to be saying that it's not okay that 5 people are killed on average every day and 80 people are seriously injured. And we need to go back to the basics with the data, and and not just tell people what the data is and what it says, and obviously, like I said, bring in real stories and real people who have real stories as part of that data, because I think that's really important. You can't deal with the data on its own. You've got to make it real every time and relatable. But we've also got to be saying it's not okay. And I think we can get caught up in this world of, well, we need to be seen to be promoting our organisation. So if we work, you know, as a local authority or a Safer Roads partnership, we've got to say that we're doing really good things. And we are. But we've also got to say how bad things are out there. We cannot hide behind, you know, we can't pretend things are good, because they aren't. And even though we've made huge improvements in reducing road harm compared to, like, looking back to like the 80s or something, we've hugely reduced road death. We've managed to stagnate, you know, the numbers have stagnated now for far too long. We need more outcry. We need to be up in arms about that data. We need to be letting people know the horror of it, so that people can be more shocked. And by keeping it from people, by not making sure that we tell people those sorts of horrible, awful figures, nationally so as well. I think this is it. I think we can all get lost in our local worlds, talking about our local data, which is really important, but we do need that national bigger picture that everybody as a road user in the UK can understand and feel. Actually, there's a lot of risk out there on those roads, and I'm not sure people live their lives thinking that. We don't scare people, of course we don't, but people are probably more likely to be frightened about things that are less likely to hurt them than actually something that's all around us, which is road harm. And we just need to be really real about that.
So, I mean, I think that brings out another issue that I'd really like us to spend a bit of time talking about, and different ones of you will have a different perspective on this, which is if I go back to being a local government officer, managing communications around road safety issues, I find myself with this kind of weird dichotomy that on the one hand, I want to present the issue of road risk as being, present, of being real, of being a challenge to our lives, because that, by amplifying that message, you raise the fact that we need to be more urgent in our action about in addressing it. At the same time, like, I'm conscious that I'm reflecting the views or reflecting the reputations of a range of local authority partners who are trying to do the best that they can with constrained resources, and that you can't force them to sort of promise to deliver a load of things that they are going to be unable to deliver on. And I was just wondering whether, how we hold those things in tension of, on the one hand, we want people to walk, to cycle, to enjoy the public realm, because we recognise that there are huge benefits associated with that. And we want decision makers to advance the things that we are looking for. Are there ways in which actually we can really utilise the data and the evidence to be the bridge between those perspectives and to give us some kind of common currency that we can use? Robert, you were sort of nodding along a bit there, so I'm going to push it in your direction first, but others, please do come in.
I think I guess there's an analogy I sometimes use when I'm thinking about this stuff, and it's really relatively close. It's not that far as an analogy, but it's organizations that are advocating for access for disabled people, sometimes are faced with so my analogy is, the local authority comes and says, okay, we are opening up access into the big theatre, for the big city theatre. It's going to be through the kitchen and the back door. It's great, isn't it? Because there has been no access into the theatre if you're a wheelchair user, and now there is. Isn't that great? So as an access organisation, you're then in this difficult situation, whereas you want to make friends with people and say, thank you so much, it's great, I'm really pleased, I'm very enthusiastic, please keep going, because actually that is complete rubbish. Nobody wants to have access to the kitchen. How do you communicate that to the world outside, which is, we're pleased that we can now get in, but it's nowhere near enough. You're barely scratching the surface, and I think that's kind of what I see around, things like infrastructure that's put in place for cycling, for example. It's like, well, it's a bit rubbish, to choose a polite word, but maybe it's better than what was there before, which was nothing. But how that's the analogy I use when I'm talking about this stuff. I think it's a really, really difficult problem, and I guess for me, what it comes down to is sometimes the personal contact. So if you are going to go back to that person in your local authority and say, thank you, but then your best bet is to know them, and for it to be friendly and respectful, and for them to know you as a human being, rather than it to be kind of fought over X or Twitter or whatever we're going to call it.
Go on, Ian, you look like you're about to come in there.
Again, I'm going to budge us on a little bit, Dan, if you don't mind. I just was thinking when Robert was talking about the credibility of the tension that you've just described, Dan. So you've described a very clear tension which exists in every part of life, doesn't it? And I do wonder. I'm thinking about my NHS days. I used to be senior manager in hospital group that straddled county boundaries. I won't talk about maternity care more than 20 seconds, but we had huge debates about the safety of maternity care. It's topical again at the moment. And there was a huge tension between local versus infrastructure and high quality. I'm not saying local is necessarily bad quality, but where do you want all your anaesthetists and your obstetricians and your theatres? So that tension is really, really difficult, and often the public want access locally. If I go back to what we're talking about here today, I think those tensions are still equal. You've described them. What I would say is it depends on the players in who are the policy actors, who are the leadership voices, who are the politicians in those spaces, who are the disability groups. In thinking about Robert's example, and often I observe that we have very charismatic political leaders who have brilliant speeches and they're very persuasive. But if they're talking a load of rubbish, people hear the persuasiveness, not the lack of substance to what they're actually saying. So whilst it's not an answer to your question very directly, Dan, I do think the credibility of the argument in itself, but also the credibility of the people that are putting forward those arguments. And then back to the audience thing that I mentioned earlier, if you can try and kind of get your Swiss cheese, if you like, your holes all lined up in a way that moves the debate forward, I really do think that you can move some of this forward. But back to my other point earlier, this is really complicated stuff. Policy making is really often chaotic. If you read the literature, chaos is the word that is often used. I came to this a few years ago, and I thought, it can't possibly be chaotic, can you? Do A, B, and C, and you come up with the answer. Of course, that's really simple, isn't it? We've got a policy cycle. We just need to go all the way around it. Obviously not, no. And that's why I think all of this is nuanced. All of this is really quite complex and difficult. And it's just finding the kind of the sweet spot on which you can move something forward. And that will be different depending on circumstance and issues, I think.
So you talked there, Ian, about the kind of the credibility piece and the credibility of voices, and taking just this theme around sort of data and advocacy. I've done a fair bit of work over the years with NGOs across the world, trying to help them to increase their credibility and their capacity to speak to power. And one of the things I've found in an awful lot of other jurisdictions is like it's really hard for them to make the argument when they haven't got any data to back that up. So, to go back to sort of Robert's example earlier, where he could just access the Stats 19 data and say, look, here's what the data says. That is not the case in many other places. What are the things that we need to increase that credibility and make our voice more potent with those decision makers?
That back to me.
Yeah.
I think I just repeat what I said right at the beginning, Dan, which is the way I do my advocacy. It is primary, secondary. So I really do think that having a strong case that is really difficult to knock over, and if you start with the data, you build that up with the evidence, and you add the stuff that all those clever academics out there have put together over 30-year period. Britain is very good at this stuff. We're very good at this stuff. If you start there and then you start to look at the layers of the onion with all the other things that we've talked about today, it's a lot of the things that are in the chat, lots of good debate going on in there. I really do think you could start to move that forward. If you layer in the stories that Rebecca was talking about, I think that is also really very powerful. But if you talk to people like Barry Shearman, the ex-MP for Huddersfield, who's been a very, very well, who's been a very strong advocate for lots of different things, but transport safety, road safety specifically, he talks about Hearts and Flowers campaigns and the weaknesses of them. Now, the Hearts and Flowers campaigns is a direct quote from him, but what he then goes on to kind of imply is that flowers die, and therefore campaigns will die, because if we only focus on the Hearts and Flowers part of this, without the substance of evidence, without trying to build relationships with policymakers, without understanding how they're operating, that they're in a very complex often very pressured political environment, and if we just shout at them, they're just going to disengage. So none of this is kind of step one, step two, step three, but it's about thinking about the individual set of circumstances. Internationally, and I know lots of jurisdictions don't have the level of data. We are very lucky to have Stats 19 and the NHS data set and lots of other things within Britain. Really powerful. I think one of the problems with that is it's too much. Getting hold of all of that stuff is really very important. And when you're trying to join them together, trying to get the Stats 19 stuff to talk to the NHS stuff or even the public health stuff, it's almost impossible. So I'm kind of going off on one slightly. I do think it's about just being fairly considered about what you're trying to do and be a little bit patient with this. A lot of people aren't patient and they just end up shouting and getting really disillusioned. And I observe a lot of if I put my victim hat on for a minute, I observe lots of my fellow campaigning victims burning out and being damaged because of the campaigning that they're doing. And this isn't a criticism of any of them, but I do think that there is they come from all walks of life, and they're not necessarily exposed to the stuff that we're talking about here today. And I guess I'm not lucky. I don't feel lucky at all, but I have an advantage in that I came from the kind of the corporate stroke public sector in big organizations, managing big complex programs, running things across England, etc. So I come with a different understanding, but I do think sometimes we don't help some of the victim groups to understand some of this complexity and to be a little bit patient. And they often hook their campaigning and their advocacy with the death of their child or the death of their mother or whoever, and it becomes very, very, very personal. And I worry that some of these people are I call them colleagues. Probably shouldn't call them colleagues, but that they're potentially going to get damaged if we don't help them move this along.
Yeah, I'm going to come to Will Cubbin has made a comment about incrementalism, actually, which I think sort of builds on that sort of recognition that some things do take time, and actually there are some wins that we can pursue on the way. I do just I'm going to pause at this point to say that please, if you have got questions that you would like to feed into Ian, Robert and Rebecca, please do stick those into chat, because into the Q&A, because it would be great to feed in some of your questions, but also just to draw people's attention to what is going on in chat if you're not engaged there already. Kate Carpenter has very helpfully posted a couple of links to some Rory Sutherland resources. His BBC podcast series on hacking the unconscious brain is excellent if you want a little intro to some of that. But I am also wondering whether Kate is a Bob Mortimer fan, because Bob Mortimer's dad was a biscuit designer, apparently, and she said that that's how she operates as a sort of pseudo career. So that's quite interesting. I'll have to have that conversation with Kate at some point. So let me come back to that sort of incrementalism point, and maybe Rebecca sort of go to you. You know, what Will is essentially saying is that if we try and change the behaviours at the far end, that's a big ask. Actually breaking the thing down to think about what are some of the changes that we're really looking for, and a change in policy direction, or a change, you know, in the sort of hearts and minds of the decision makers. Those are key building blocks for us to actually get the ultimate change that we're looking for. And it may be that there's different evidence that we need to help us win that at different points. I don't know whether you want to sort of reflect on any of the sort of things that you've done to try and sort of move the dial incrementally to try and bring partners and others with us.
Yeah, funnily enough, you know, that is something that I'm thinking about more and more just lately is, okay, you know, if we rely on that casualty data that we talk about being reactive and not proactive, you know, we're waiting for people to be killed, we're relying on this casualty data to know whether we have problems or not, and we just carry on using that data like we've always done. I think it's only the tip of the iceberg, and I think we need to make sure that we are exploring what else is out there that helps us present our case, because clearly government decision makers, they don't seem as shocked as we are about the 5 people being killed every day and the 80 seriously injured, because if they did, I think they'd have done something by now. We wouldn't still be waiting for a road safety strategy with no date in sight really yet. So I think, are we downplaying the problem by not going deeper, by keep relying on those figures alone? And data obviously is underreporting, but also there are so many things that aren't ever recorded. It's very difficult, as in the mental impact to people and the drain on the NHS. And I'm not a statistician, I can barely say the word, let alone certainly not an analyst. But in my communication, I'm thinking, right, we need evidence. Well, where is this data? And it's something I've been talking to Professor Tim Nutbeam about recently, is what NHS data is available to us that can strengthen our case. And I'm sure there must be so much more information that if we could just get our hands on, this picture is a lot bigger than the way we've been painting it for so long. You know, in terms of, I at the Vision Zero Summit in Greater Manchester a couple of weeks ago, the clinician there, the surgeon there said, you know, survival is just the start of the journey. And that really spelled it out for me, is yes, okay, so that person survived, and in our data, it's almost, a death is obviously the most serious injury, well, at least you didn't die. Slight injury, oh well, at least you only had a finger injury, but no one's talking about the trauma, the bigger picture to that. We need to fill in all of those gaps. You know, what about that person who did survive but was the sole earner for the family, and now his, you know, maybe a husband and his wife is now his full-time carer, and you know, he's then going for operation after operation for the rest of his life, and his children were on the cusp of doing something with their lives, and then their whole path has been altered because of this one crash, which, if we just look at our casualty data, is just one serious injury. The ripple effect of that is absolutely phenomenal and mind-blowing. And I think if we started looking at the data in terms of the impact on people's health in one way or another, physical, mental, everybody attached to that crash in some way, and that victim, and then started looking at the kind of the mental impact, and just went wider, it would blow our minds. And if we attach some financial costs to that as well, maybe people will start listening if we're talking about that. If we're not moved enough by the emotional side, which is shocking that we don't, but if we're not, then why will we not? Will we start listening to the numbers? Ian's got to.
Yeah, I'll come to you just
time-wise. Sorry, go on.
I'll come to you in just a second, Ian. But actually, I was wondering. So one of the comments in the chat was from Keith, who talked about like increasing the sort of fidelity of that data more by using things like quality adjusted life years, so that we go beyond those crude, was it a fatal, was it a serious, was it a slight, and we start to actually get a richer data set that tells us how life-changing and economically destructive some of these things are. But Ian, over to you.
I just wondered, Rebecca, push back slightly. I do wonder whether the stories of people who were living the lives that you described and are now not, or the example, I won't repeat the examples you've listed, but people in a wheelchair, or people who could walk and now they can't, or whatever that might be, those stories are out there. They're all, particularly in local media. If you look at the trauma centres, if you look at the charity work that happens around the trauma centres, those stories are everywhere of lives affected and changed forever. I just look at my local press. It's every week there's something in the news. So I wonder whether it's not that they're not there. It just fits into the wider discussion we're having about evidence and data, that actually people are just not listening to that, and we need different approaches to how we kind of elevate those stories, and those combined with the evidence and the data. How many people have catastrophic spinal injuries? DFT started to publish some of that data a while back and then stopped. And it's making them more visible, I'm suggesting, rather than they're not there in the first place.
I think it's there, isn't it, Ian? But it's a bit like road crashes themselves and the way the media report on them. You know, there's one here, there's one there, there's one up there, there's one. So yes, we might be seeing this, but we need to bring it together to tell that bigger picture, don't we? It's a huge job, and I think we need a highly skilled person or team to work on that. But you know, I think it's something that we should really explore as soon as possible.
Can I come in on that?
Yeah,
just
please.
Briefly. So I think what really strikes me is that the problem with a lot of this is that people can't imagine something different. So, you know, we're used to it, aren't we? We hear bad stuff in the news, and it's like, well, what can I do about that? Well, there's nothing I can do about it. I don't, you know, it's something I'm going to kind of put over there. I'm a bit cross about it, but I can't really do anything in my daily life. And I think for me, what can be really exciting about this work is that actually there is stuff that can be done which is very different and which gets people excited. So that's kind of goes back to what I was saying right at the beginning for myself, which is a sort of opening people's eyes thing. The people I talk to, if I get it right, when I get it right, the occasions I get it right, somebody will come back to me excited, not depressed, not angry, but just like, oh, I'd never noticed that. That's fascinating. Why do we keep doing that? And you're right, it could be so different, couldn't it, Robert? That becomes, yeah, it's exciting, and that then it's also about opening up that vision that the streets don't have to be most people in Britain, almost everybody in Britain, even the engineers in Britain, assume that our streets are designed in a fairly sensible way. Ian, you talked about there isn't, you know, policy doesn't make much sense. You know, it doesn't happen the way that people think it does. Engineering doesn't either. You know, the streets, everybody assumes, even the engineers assume that, you know, the big guides for trunk roads must be based on evidence, when they're actually just a philosophy. It's just a set of, it's just a set of ideas that people have come up with. It's a standard. Standards are good because everything's to be expected, but it's not based on anything. You know, so I think once we can open people's eyes up to the fact that the streets could be physically different, whilst still allowing, I say that, whilst still allowing for, you know, I'm not saying different because now everybody, you know, walks everywhere and nobody ever drives. Let's have that argument separately. But whilst people are still driving, the streets can be different, and they can be substantially safer for people who are not driving and substantially safer for people who are driving. That becomes exciting. That's something that people can get behind and be excited about, I think. Because now it's like, it's back to that, Dan, you said it, you're the person in the room going, but don't you know it can be different? You know, you can be that person in the room. And I guess I wanted to add one second thought, just really briefly on top of that, which is just the idea, which I've always found very powerful, which is that change doesn't happen the way that people assume. And you almost don't need to know, how does it work? You just need to know it, not like that. That thing you think that is going to make the change happen probably won't, because it's more complex than that. Go off, do some reading, do some listening about change. You will come up with 100 different theories about how it works. But the main point is to realize that that thing that you think is going to work isn't. So Ian, your example, you know, the people campaigning for something thinking they're going to get that change happening because they've got some policy that's going to come through is going to suddenly change everything. And we know it won't work. You know,
I fairly recently finished Matt Ridley's book, How Innovation Works, which very, very much articulates that view, Robert. So that's really helpful. We're starting to run out of time, but I want to get to Claire Baker's question, which is around, like, again, sort of bringing another player into this. The researchers and the academics obviously don't want to just be producing research that sits on a dusty shelf, but want to be supportive of, like, the change that we want to see happen. So her question is really about how can researchers and academics be supportive of bringing about that change and support those advocacy efforts. So anyone want to have a crack at taking that one on?
I'll have a go.
Go on, Ian. Thank you.
When I did my thesis, I read loads of articles like we all do. And one of the things that struck me, almost like a little bit of a light bulb, there was some absolutely amazing pieces of research and studies with wonderful methodologies, beautifully written, and about what we ought to be doing. And right at the end of it, it says, oh, and policymakers need to do it. So I think one of the things that is, I would suggest, and it's based on the public the political science evidence and literature, is think about policy making and not just the policy. And I do think if we start to engage with how, yes, it is chaotic, yes, it is complicated, yes, it has bias in it, yes, it's not A, B, and C, but actually, if we start to think much more about the people that we're trying to engage with who are trying to make policy, but it's the process of policy making. One of my supervisors, Professor Greg Marsden and Louise Reardon, wrote a really wonderful piece, I thought, that went into, I think, 150 articles in the academic journals that basically said the majority of them is about what we ought to be doing. And if all the debate, not that that's wrong, but it's about balance. If all the debate is about what we're doing in trying to improve transport safety, is all about the policy and what the engineering, what the tarmac on the road needs to look like, or what the speed level needs to be, and we don't engage in the people and the policy making and the approach to how we do that, we're missing a really big trick. And I guess my message to I've forgotten the lady's name already. I'm really sorry that asked the question.
Claire.
Claire, sorry, Claire, I apologise. It is actually, yes, be immersed in your world or the academics world in terms of what you're doing, your expertise and your skill, because that's beautiful and wonderful and we're learning so much from it. But just think about how that transitions into a different conversation, a different place, and focus much more about policy making rather than just the policy.
Great. Rebecca, Robert, did you want to come in on that at all?
I think Ian answered.
Only one thing to add, I think, that jumps to mind, which is something about the value of research or inquiry, which doesn't just do the measurable stuff. That I've been recently involved in a fairly big piece of research where actually I think a lot of the value was from the talking to people and kind of embracing the subjectivity of the problem, because it wasn't a problem that could be solved with really solid, it wasn't a mathematical problem. You know, it's like how this kind of infrastructure, how frightened are people of it, and do they stop using streets because they're frightened of it, and does that mean that disabled people don't, and actually it's an unmeasurable problem and the solution can't be proven, but you can argue your way through it. So what we did was to work our way through and say, well, we think that evidence plus that evidence, our reading of that leads to us to these conclusions, but there's our working, you make your own minds up. And I think that's been a very well received piece of research, but it's not academic. It's not, you know, there's very few numbers in there.
Sure.
And I kind of want to emphasize the value of that, I think. And for me, a lot of this kind of, you know, little simple bits of research, I mentioned to you, Dan, in our initial chat, popping out and talking to 3 people who experienced the thing that we're researching and having a chat with them can be the most valuable bit of a piece of research, you know, before you get anywhere near any numbers, because that's the bit where you learn some real stuff.
That's great. Okay, I'm aware that we are right on sort of time for when we're supposed to conclude, and we don't want to overstay our welcome and leave you to the rest of your afternoon. It's been a fascinating conversation. There's been some great contributions in the chat. If you want more of this content, please do make sure that you have signed up at roadsafety.network, and you can get access to any of the forthcoming webinars, and also just a date for your diary. 3rd of March next year will be the next Joining the Dots conference at Austin Court in Birmingham, where we were this year as well. But it just remains for me to express my thanks to Rebecca, to Robert, and to Ian. Really appreciate your time, your thoughtfulness, your wisdom. It's been a really helpful conversation. I think there are quite a few key takeaways that if I'd allowed myself a little bit more time, I might sort of try and summarize. But, you know, sort of not just using data to align to our preconceived opinions, I think, is a key theme, but being willing to open ourselves up to the availability of a broader range of data, qualitative and quantitative, to help shape decision making would be very, very helpful. But there we are on time. So thank you very much, everyone who's been with us this afternoon. And Kate Carpenter get back to designing biscuits. Look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank you too, Dan.
Thanks,
Thank
Dan.
you. Bye.
Everybody.